The notebook smelled like old leather and something else, motor oil maybe, or the inside of a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. Raymond pressed it into my hands with both of his, the way you hand someone something breakable, and he didn't say much. Just 4 words low and even, like he'd been rehearsing them for a long time. Don't let them bury this with me. Then the orderly wheeled him through the double doors, and he was gone. I stood in that hallway for probably 2 full minutes. The fluorescent lights in Piedmont, Atlanta hum at a frequency that gets behind your eyes after a while. I noticed that. I noticed the squeaking of rubber soles on linoleum somewhere around the corner. I noticed everything except what I was holding, because some part of me already knew that once I looked down at that notebook, the version of my life I'd been living for 6 years was going to be over. I was right. Before we go any further, what time is it where you are right now? Drop your time and your country in the comments. I want to know who's up with me for this one. Atlanta in the early morning has a specific kind of quiet that doesn't exist anywhere else. Not silence. The city is never fully silent, but a held breath. The kind that happens before heat settles in and the day becomes what it's going to be. I used to stand on the back porch of our house on Habersham Road with my first cup of coffee and just exist inside that quiet for 10-15 minutes before anything was required of me. That was the best part of my day most days. The house was Elliot's idea. 4,000 square feet, a double staircase, a kitchen that had been featured in an Atlanta Homes and Lifestyles spread 3 years ago. It was beautiful the way a hotel lobby is beautiful, designed to impress people who were passing through, not to hold the life of someone who actually lived there. I kept fresh flowers on the entryway table every week. Peonies when they were in season, white tulips when they weren't. Nobody ever commented on them except Raymond. He'd come by on Sunday afternoons when Elliot was playing golf, and he'd stop at the entryway table and touch one of the petals with 2 fingers, careful as if he was handling something rare, and say something like, "You keep this house alive, Caroline." Not a compliment exactly, more like an observation. The kind a man makes when he's been watching something for a long time and finally decided to say it out loud. I should have listened more carefully to Raymond from the beginning. I met Elliot Hargrove at a fundraiser for the Atlanta Legal Aid Society 8 years ago. He was 33 already, a named partner at his father's firm, Hargrove and Associates, which handled estate law and corporate contracts for half the old money black families in Buckhead. He had the kind of confidence that reads as competence until you've known someone long enough to tell the difference. He wore it well. I didn't know enough then to look for the seams. I was 30 years old 2 years into my position as a compliance officer at a mid-size investment firm downtown. I'd grown up in Decatur modest household parents who worked hard and talked openly about money because they'd learned the hard way what happened when you didn't. My mother kept a ledger, actual paper, actual pen every month. Income expenses, a column she called "What We're Building." I inherited her precision, if not her patience. Elliot said on our 3rd date that he'd never met a woman who understood numbers the way I did. I took that as a compliment. Later, I would understand it was reconnaissance. We married after 2 years. The wedding was at a venue in Midtown, 240 guests, a band that played until midnight. Raymond stood during the toasts and said simply that he was glad his son had found someone steadier than himself. There was a pause after he said it. A few people laughed, assuming it was a joke. Elliot laughed too. Raymond sat back down and looked at his water glass. I didn't laugh. I filed it away. The first 4 years of our marriage were not unhappy. That's the most honest way I can put it. Not unhappy. Elliot worked long hours, traveled frequently for client meetings, moved through the world with an ease that came from never having had to justify his presence anywhere. We had dinners, vacations, a social calendar that required its own spreadsheet to manage. We had a life that looked from any reasonable distance like the kind people aspired to. What we didn't have was the conversation, the real one. The one where you sit across from someone and say what you actually think without calculating how it will land. Elliot didn't have that gear. At first, I thought it was shyness dressed up as reserve. Then I thought it was just the way he was built, the product of a family that performed rather than revealed. By year 4, I had stopped waiting for it. Raymond and I had it instead. Not about anything dramatic. Not confessions or warnings, not in those years. We talked about Atlanta, about the neighborhoods changing, about a book he'd read about my mother's health when she had her hip replaced. He asked real questions and listened to the real answers. He called me the steady one. So many times it became a kind of name. I didn't know then what he meant by it, that he was watching his son watching me, keeping a mental record of the gap between what Elliot said and what Elliot did. I didn't know he was also keeping a written one. By year 5, something had shifted in Elliot that I could feel but not yet see. He became more attentive in a way that felt practiced rather than genuine. Brought home flowers, suggested weekends away, touched my shoulder in public with a new kind of deliberateness. It reminded me of the way certain clients at my firm would become suddenly cooperative right before an audit. Pleasant in a way that had a purpose underneath it. I noticed. I didn't yet know what I was noticing. The Sunday before Raymond's hospitalization, Elliot didn't play golf. He stayed home and worked in his study with the door shut, which he rarely did on weekends. At one point I walked past and heard him on the phone, voice low and clipped, saying a number 2.3, and then stopping when he heard my footsteps in the hallway. I kept walking. Got my coffee. Stood on the back porch in the morning quiet. The peonies on the entryway table had started to droop at the edges. I'd forgotten to change the water. It was the first time in 6 years I had forgotten. The document started in March. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious even for Elliot. They came in 1s and 2s, tucked inside larger folders of routine paperwork that actually did require my signature. Refinancing disclosures, a property insurance update, a form related to the joint investment account we'd held since year 2 of our marriage. He'd fan them out on the kitchen counter after dinner, casual as spreading mail, and hand me a pen before I'd had a chance to sit down properly. I am a compliance officer. I have spent 11 years of my professional life reading documents that are specifically designed to obscure what they're actually doing. I know what buried language looks like. I know the difference between a standard indemnification clause and one that has been quietly expanded to include future liabilities not yet specified. I know that when a document uses the phrase, "as mutually agreed upon," without referencing any prior agreement, something is missing on purpose. I knew all of this, and still I signed 3 of them before I slowed down enough to really look. The first one I caught was in April. A 2-page addendum to something Elliot described as a restructuring of the Hargrove Family Trust routine. He said something his firm did every few years for estate planning purposes. I had the pen in my hand. I read the second page. There was a clause near the bottom, paragraph 7, that referenced a transfer of jointly held appreciable assets into a newly established entity identified only by a filing number. No name, no description of the entity. Just a number 2024, LLCATL 00892. I put the pen down. "What's the LLC?" I asked. Elliot was at the refrigerator with his back to me. "It's just a holding structure. Standard estate tool, keeps things clean for tax purposes." "Whose name is it in?" "It's a family entity, Caroline. It's not complicated." I didn't say it was complicated. I asked whose name it's in. He turned around then, smiled the way he smiled at difficult clients, patient slightly above it all. "I'll have Denise send over the full filing if it makes you feel better." Denise was his paralegal. The full filing never came. I didn't sign that one. What I did instead was take a photograph of page 2 with my phone before I slid it back into the folder. I didn't say anything about that. I just filed the image away in a folder I labeled House Maintenance. An old habit from work, hiding important things in boring-sounding places. After that, I started paying a different kind of attention. Small things first. Elliot had always handled the household accounts, something we'd agreed on early in the marriage, because his schedule was more flexible and mine was not. And because at the time, I trusted that a man who ran an estate law firm knew how to manage money responsibly. I had access to the accounts, but I rarely checked them the way you don't check the smoke detector if you haven't smelled anything burning. I started checking. The joint checking account looked normal. The joint savings account looked normal. But there was a third account. A money market account I'd nearly forgotten we had opened in year one as a vehicle for short-term investments. And in that account, the balance had dropped from $340,000 to $180,000 over the course of 14 months. The withdrawals were listed as transfers. The destination account number was not one I recognized. I wrote the number down on a Post-it note and stuck it inside my work planner between February and March. I did not confront Elliot. Not yet. I had grown up watching my mother keep her ledger, and the first thing she ever taught me about it was this: don't react to a number until you understand where it came from. A number by itself is just a fact. A number in context is either a relief or a reckoning. I needed context before I could know which one I was looking at. What I had at that point was a feeling. Specific and physical, a tightening across my sternum, the kind that isn't quite anxiety and isn't quite anger, but lives somewhere between the two. The feeling of seeing a pattern you were hoping wasn't there. Raymond called me on a Thursday in early May. Not unusual, he called most weeks, sometimes twice. But this call was shorter than normal. He asked how I was. I said fine. He said good. Then he was quiet for a moment and said, "You still have that sharp eye of yours, don't you, Caroline?" It wasn't a question. "I try to," I said. Another pause. "Good." And then, "Come see me this weekend if you can. Bring nothing, just yourself." I went on Saturday. Elliot was in Savannah for a client meeting. Raymond made coffee and we sat on his back porch on Cascade Road, the one with the old wind chimes his late wife had hung, and we talked about nothing consequential for almost an hour. Then he went inside and came back out with a small stack of folders and set them on the table between us without explanation. I looked at him. "I'm not as sharp as I used to be," he said. "My memory comes and goes. But I've been writing things down for a long time." He tapped the top folder. "You don't have to look at these today, but I need you to know they exist." I looked at the folders, then back at him. "Raymond." "Not today," he said. "Just no." 3 weeks later, he collapsed in his kitchen. Cardiac event, the doctors said. Serious enough to require surgery. Elliot got the call first and relayed it to me in the hallway outside our bedroom at 11 o'clock at night, already in his coat, already reaching for his keys, already moving in the way he moved when he was controlling something fast, contained, not leaving room for anyone else to insert themselves. He got to the hospital before me. By the time I arrived, he was already deep in conversation with 2 men I didn't recognize. Near the end of the hallway, dark suits, no hospital badges, not doctors. They stopped talking when they saw me coming. Elliot walked toward me with his arms open. "He's stable," he said. "They're taking him into surgery in the morning." I hugged him. Over his shoulder, I watched the 2 men exchange a look and walk in opposite directions unhurried, like they'd just concluded something. I sat with Raymond that night after visiting hours because one of the nurses recognized me from a charity event years before and looked the other way. He was tired. His color was off. But his eyes were clear, and when I took his hand, he squeezed back with more pressure than I expected. The folders on my porch, he said without preamble. I remember. There are more. Inside the blue notebook, breast pocket of my gray coat hanging by the door. He closed his eyes for a moment, opened them. Don't let Elliot into that house before you go. I left at midnight. I drove to Cascade Road. I used the spare key Raymond had given me 3 years ago, the one I kept on a separate ring from my regular keys, for no reason I could have explained at the time. The gray coat was hanging by the door. The blue notebook was in the breast pocket, exactly where he said it would be. I took it and locked the house behind me and sat in my car in Raymond's driveway for a long time before I started the engine. I didn't open it that night. I put it in my bag and drove home and lay in the dark next to Elliot, who was already asleep. And I listened to him breathe. And I thought about my mother's ledger, about the column she called What We're Building, about what it means when someone has been building something without you. The morning of Raymond's surgery, Elliot woke at 5:30. I heard him before I saw him. The particular sound of a man moving through a house with intention drawers opening and closing in the bathroom. The specific weight of his footsteps when he was focused on something, not the loose, unhurried rhythm of a Sunday morning. The compressed, deliberate cadence of a man with a schedule inside his head that he hadn't shared with anyone else. I lay still and kept my breathing even. He left at 6:15 without waking me. He thought I was asleep. I had been awake since 4. I got up 20 minutes after I heard the front door close, dressed in whatever was closest, dark jeans, a gray cashmere pullover, flat boots, and put Raymond's notebook in the inside pocket of my coat before I left the house. I don't know exactly why I did that. Some instinct that said, keep it on your body, don't leave it somewhere it can be found. The same instinct, I think, that made my mother sew a pocket into the lining of her winter coat to keep the household cash separate from her purse. Practical, quiet, not paranoid, just prepared. I stopped for gas on Peachtree Road and stood outside in the early cold while the tank filled and called the hospital to confirm Raymond's surgery time. 8:45. I had time. What I did with that time was sit in the parking lot of a Publix on Piedmont Avenue and open the notebook. Raymond's handwriting was small and precise. The handwriting of a man trained in an era when penmanship meant something, when you were graded on the loops of your letters and the consistency of your spacing. Even in the later entries, where the pressure of the pen had lightened, and some of the lines drifted slightly upward toward the right margin, the words were legible. Deliberate. Every entry dated. Every entry signed with his initials at the bottom right corner, the way you'd sign a legal document. R.A.H. Raymond Allen Hargrove. The first entry was dated March 14th, 2021. Elliot asked me to co-sign a refinancing document today for the Cascade Road property. I declined. He said it was routine. I asked him to explain the secondary beneficiary clause on page 4. He could not. I turned the page. April 2nd, 2021. Received a call from Jerome Whitfield at First Southern Bank. He wanted to confirm my awareness of a trust amendment filed under my name last month. I was not aware of any amendment. I did not sign one. I have asked my personal attorney, David Osei, to investigate. Have not told Elliot. R.A.H. I turned the page again, and again, and again. The entries ran for 3 years. 41 pages, both sides written in Raymond's small, careful hand. A record of a man watching his son dismantle a family's financial legacy, one document at a time. Forged signatures, misdirected transfers, entities created in Raymond's name. Without his knowledge, properties quietly refinanced, and the equity siphoned into accounts Raymond had never seen. Not chaotic, methodical. The work of someone who understood estate law because he had been trained in it, who knew exactly which seams to pull on, and how slowly to pull them so that nobody noticed the fabric coming apart. And then, beginning in August of 2022, my name started appearing. Caroline Hargrove, née Okafor, Co-signatory, jointly liable. Mutually consenting party to the establishment of Hargrove Meridian Holdings, LLC, a Delaware-registered limited liability company with the Atlanta mailing address and a registered agent I had never heard of. I had never heard of Hargrove Meridian Holdings, LLC. I had apparently signed documents establishing it. I sat in that Publix parking lot for 23 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my dashboard without meaning to, the way you watch a fixed point when the ground is moving under you. A woman pushed a cart past my car with a toddler in the seat, the child holding a banana with both hands, gravely serious about it. A man in a delivery uniform jogged past with a hand truck. The ordinary world conducting its ordinary business 6 feet from where I was sitting, reading evidence that my husband had been using my identity as a financial instrument for at least 14 months. I closed the notebook. I put it back in my inside coat pocket. I started the car and drove to Piedmont, Atlanta. Elliot was in the surgery waiting area on the 4th floor when I arrived, 3rd chair from the window jacket, folded over the arm of the seat beside him, phone in both hands. He looked up when I came through the door, and his face did the thing it had been doing lately, the practiced warmth, the recalibrated smile. "There you are," he said, as if he'd been expecting me at a specific time I hadn't been told. I sat down 2 seats away from him. "How is he?" I asked. "In surgery. They said it should be 3, maybe 4 hours." He reached over and put his hand on my knee. "He's strong. He'll be fine." I nodded and looked at the window. We sat in silence for a while. A television mounted in the corner was showing a morning news program with the sound off, closed captions running half a second behind the anchors' mouths. A family across the room spoke to each other in low voices, a grandmother working a rosary, a teenage boy with headphones around his neck staring at the floor. At 9:47, a nurse came to the door of the waiting room and said Raymond's name. We both stood. The nurse spoke to Elliot first because Elliot was the one who stepped forward, the one who occupied space in a room the way he always did, by moving toward the center of it before anyone else had decided where to stand. I stayed where I was. The nurse said the surgery was going well. Raymond was stable on the table. They expected to be finished by noon. Elliot asked 2 questions. Technical, precise. The questions of a man who needed to sound engaged without revealing what he was actually thinking about. Then the nurse left, and Elliot turned back to me with his hands in his pockets and said, "You okay? You seem quiet." "Long morning," I said. He nodded, looked at me for a moment with something behind his eyes that I couldn't fully read, assessment maybe, or the beginning of suspicion. Then his phone buzzed, and he looked down at it, and whatever he'd been calculating reset itself. "I need to make a call," he said. "Give me 10 minutes." He walked out into the hallway. I watched him go through the glass panel beside the waiting room door, watched him move down the corridor, away from the nurse's station, away from the elevators, toward the quieter end of the hall, where there were no patients and no staff. And the overhead lights had the slightly dimmer quality of a section not often used. He stopped near a supply closet, put the phone to his ear. I counted to 15. Then I took Raymond's notebook out of my coat pocket and photographed every single page with my phone. From front and back, 41 pages, 82 photographs, systematic and fast, the way I did everything when the stakes were high enough. I finished with 4 minutes to spare before Elliot came back through the waiting room door. I had the notebook in my pocket and my hands folded in my lap. And I was looking at the silent television when he sat down beside me, closer this time. Close enough that his arm pressed against mine. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Work thing," he said. "Nothing major." I looked at the television. A weather map. A cold front moving down from the Carolinas, the meteorologist's hand sweeping across the blue mass of it with practiced calm. "Raymond asked me something last night," I said. Casual, eyes still on the screen. "When I sat with him, before they settled him in. Elliot went still beside me. Not visibly, he was too controlled for that. But the quality of his stillness changed the way a room changes when someone in it stops breathing for a second. He asked me if I still had my sharp eye, I said. A beat. That sounds like him, Elliot said. It does. I turned and looked at my husband directly for the first time that morning. I told him yes. Elliot held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then he smiled the client smile, the above-it-all smile, and looked back at the television. His right hand moved to his signet ring and turned it once around his finger. I watched him do it and thought, I know exactly what you've been building. And I know exactly how to take it apart. I did not go home that night, not because I was afraid of Elliot, not physically, not in that way, but because I understood sitting in that waiting room, watching him turn his signet ring around his finger, that I had entered a different phase of something that had been in motion for a long time, without my knowledge. And in that phase, every decision I made needed to be made from a position he couldn't see or anticipate. Going home meant going back inside the perimeter he controlled. I wasn't ready to do that yet. Raymond came out of surgery at 12:18. The surgeon found Elliot in the waiting room and delivered the update in the efficient, compressed language of someone with 3 more conversations scheduled before lunch. Successful procedure, stable condition recovery would take time, ICU for at least 48 hours, limited visitors. Elliot shook the surgeon's hand and thanked him, and turned to me with genuine relief on his face. The first genuine thing I'd seen from him all morning, because whatever else Elliot was, Raymond was still his father. I felt that. I allowed myself to feel it for exactly the length of time it took the surgeon to walk back through the double doors. Then I told Elliot I was going to get food from the cafeteria and asked if he wanted anything. He said coffee black. I went to the cafeteria, bought 2 coffees, sat at a corner table away from the windows, and called Diane Osei. Diane was not related to Raymond's attorney, David Osei. Different family, different firm, different part of the city entirely. She was my attorney. Mine specifically retained 3 years ago when Elliot had suggested we update our wills, and I had decided quietly that I wanted my own counsel reviewing anything I signed that had legal weight. I had not told Elliot about Diane then. I had not told him since. My mother kept a separate account. Small, consistent, her own name only. She called it her Clarity Fund. Not an escape fund, she always said. A clarity fund. Because sometimes you need to be able to think without someone else's name on the account where your thinking money lives. I had a clarity fund. I had a clarity attorney. I had 82 photographs of a dead man's evidence. Raymond wasn't dead, but he'd handed that notebook over like a man putting his affairs in order, and I wasn't going to treat it as anything less than what it was. Diane picked up on the second ring. I need an emergency consult, I said. Today, if possible. I have documentation. A pause. The sound of her moving a door closing. How serious. 14 months of fraudulent transfers using my signature. A Delaware LLC established in my name without my knowledge. 41 pages of contemporaneous witness notes written by a 71-year-old man who just went into cardiac surgery this morning. Another pause. Longer. Can you be at my office at 4? She said. Yes. Bring the originals, if you have them, and the photographs. Don't discuss this with anyone between now and then. Not a friend, not a family member, not my husband, I said. Especially not your husband. I hung up. Sat for another minute with both hands around my coffee cup, feeling the warmth of it against my palms. The cafeteria was half on full, a family at one table, a man in scrubs eating alone by the window. 2 women in their 60s talking in low, urgent voices over untouched sandwiches. The ordinary architecture of a hospital afternoon. People in holding patterns waiting for news that would reorganize everything. I carried Elliot's coffee back upstairs. He was where I'd left him, jacket back on now, phone in hand. He took the cup without looking up. I sat, and we maintained the performance of a worried couple for another hour and 40 minutes, occasional exchanges, his hand on mine. Twice my head briefly on his shoulder once when a particularly long silence made it seem like the natural thing to do. At 2:30, I told him I needed to go home and check on a few work things, that I'd be back by evening. He said that was fine. He'd stay. I took the elevator down, walked through the lobby, pushed through the glass doors into the afternoon air. Atlanta in May has a specific quality of light, in the mid-afternoon, heavy and golden. The kind that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it hit my face. Then I got in my car and drove not home, but to my office downtown. I had a filing cabinet in my office with a combination lock, a habit from early in my career, when I'd worked on sensitive audits and needed secure physical storage. The combination was my mother's birthday. I opened it and put Raymond's notebook inside, in a manila envelope labeled with a project code I'd retired 2 years ago. Then I sat at my desk and spent 90 minutes doing something I should have done 4 months earlier, when I first noticed the money market balance dropping. I pulled every financial statement I had access to. Joint checking, joint savings, the money market, the investment brokerage account, the mortgage statement, the insurance policies. I printed them. I organized them by date. I made a second copy and sealed it in a second envelope. Then I drove to a FedEx office on Spring Street and rented a mailbox and put the second envelope inside it. And I was the only one who knew the box number. At 3:55, I was in Diane Osei's office on Peachtree Street, 23rd floor. The kind of office with a view of the city that reminds you Atlanta is larger and older and more complicated than any single story playing out inside it. Diane was 51, precise, unhurried. She had the quality of someone who had seen most varieties of human catastrophe and had developed through years of exposure a kind of structured compassion. She felt the weight of what you brought her without being destabilized by it. She put on reading glasses and went through the photographs on my phone one by one, without speaking. When she finished, she looked up at me over the frames. "The LLC," she said. "Hargrove Meridian Holdings. Do you know who the registered agent is?" "I don't recognize the name." "I'll run it tonight." She took the glasses off. "The notebook, can we authenticate the handwriting?" "Raymond has a personal attorney, David Osei. No relation to you, I assume?" "None." A faint smile. "I'll reach out. If David Osei has been tracking this independently, we may already have more than we need." She set her pen down and looked at me directly. "Caroline, I need you to understand something before we go further. If what's in these photographs is accurate, and it looks accurate, your husband has committed wire fraud, identity fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty at minimum. This is not a divorce attorney situation. This is a federal situation." The word federal sat in the air between us. "I understand," I said. "You're not surprised," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "I'm not surprised. I'm just finally in the right room." Diane looked at me for a moment. Then she opened a fresh legal pad, clicked her pen, and wrote the date at the top of the page, in her clean, unhurried hand. "Then let's begin," she said. I drove back to the hospital at 7. Elliot was still there. Jacket off now, tie loosened the performance of a devoted son, fully committed to its run. He looked up when I came through the door, and something in his face relaxed the relief of a man who had been calculating odds and had just seen one of them resolve in his favor. He thought I'd gone home. He thought I'd changed clothes and checked emails and come back. He had no idea where I'd actually been. I sat beside him, and he took my hand and we sat together in the blue-gray quiet of the ICU waiting area. And I kept my face arranged in the expression of a woman who was worried about her father-in-law and holding her husband's hand, because that was what the moment called for. Inside my coat pocket, the manila envelope was gone, locked in my office cabinet. The photographs lived on my phone, backed up to a cloud account Elliot didn't know existed in a folder named after a restaurant we'd eaten at on our honeymoon. He was holding my hand. He had no idea whose hand he was holding anymore. Elliot found out about the notebook on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I had a 9 o'clock call with my firm's risk committee that morning, and I remember sitting at the conference room table with my phone face down in front of me, half listening to a discussion about exposure thresholds, when I felt the phone vibrate twice in quick succession, the pattern Elliot used when he was calling from his personal number, not his office line. He knew I had committee meetings on Tuesday mornings. He knew I didn't take personal calls during them. He called twice more before the meeting ended. I called him back from the elevator. "Where is it?" Not a question. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, compressed, almost airless, like a man speaking through clenched teeth while trying to sound as though he wasn't. "Good morning, Elliot." "Caroline, where is it?" I pressed the lobby button, watched the floor numbers descend. "You're going to need to be more specific." A pause. 3 seconds. 4. The kind of pause a man takes when he's deciding how much to reveal by deciding how much to ask for. My father's notebook. He had a notebook. It was in his coat at the house on Cascade Road. "I haven't been to your father's house recently," I said. Technically true. I had been there at midnight 11 days ago. "Caroline." The compressed quality in his voice had shifted into something harder. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever you think you found, whatever my father may have told you, he is not well. His cognition has been declining for over a year. His cardiologist and I have both been concerned." "His cardiologist," I said. "Dr. Anand Patel at Piedmont. I have his direct line if you need it. He spoke to me last Thursday when I visited Raymond alone. He said Raymond's cognitive function tested within normal range on his last 2 assessments." Silence. Complete total silence, the kind that has weight. I stepped out of the elevator into the lobby. The morning light was coming in through the glass front of the building at a low angle, falling across the marble floor in long, pale rectangles. A security guard nodded at me from the desk. I nodded back and kept walking toward the exit. "We should talk," Elliot said finally. His voice had recalibrated smoother now, the client voice returning the above-it-all register he reached for when the ground shifted under him, and he needed to buy time. "Not on the phone. Tonight at home. We can sit down and I can explain the full context of the financial restructuring. There are things you don't have the complete picture on." "I look forward to that conversation," I said. And I meant it. Not in the way he thought I meant it. "I'll be home by 7. I hung up before he could say anything else. He was home by 4. I know because my home security system sent an alert to my phone, a feature I had quietly reactivated 3 weeks ago after 2 years of ignoring it because the camera at the front door records and stores footage for 30 days, and I had decided I wanted a record of who came and went from my house and when. Elliot didn't know I'd reactivated it. He'd been the one to suggest turning it off originally 2 years ago, something about a privacy concern he'd read about with the cloud storage provider. I had agreed at the time. I had nodded and said that made sense. I had turned it back on 6 days after Diane O'Say wrote the date at the top of her legal pad. He was home by 4, and I was home by 6:53. And when I walked in, the house was very clean. That was the first thing I noticed. The house was always reasonably clean. We had a service that came on Thursdays, but this was a different kind of clean. The study door was open, which Elliot rarely left it. The filing drawers behind his desk were closed in a slightly different configuration than they'd been that morning. The second drawer not quite flush with the cabinet the way Elliot always kept it. The recycling bin in the kitchen had been emptied, though Thursday was 2 days away. On the kitchen counter, a stack of folders sat in a neat pile with a binder clip across the top, the kind of conspicuous organization that is actually a form of concealment, presenting tidiness as evidence of innocence. I put my bag down and went upstairs and changed into clothes that didn't require dry cleaning. When I came back down, Elliot was in the kitchen opening a bottle of wine. 2 glasses on the counter, the domestic theater of a difficult conversation being managed before it started. "Sit down," he said. Not unkindly. The voice of a man who had spent the afternoon deciding how to frame this and was now ready to deliver the framing. I sat at the kitchen island. He poured both glasses, set one in front of me, kept one for himself. Remained standing, a choice, conscious or not, to maintain the height differential. I noticed it the way I'd been noticing everything lately, not with reaction, just with record. "I want to explain the meridian structure," he said, "because I think what my father wrote in that notebook, assuming you have it, and I think you do, is going to look worse than it is without the context of what we were trying to accomplish legally." "All right," I said. "Explain it." He did. For 22 minutes, he explained it: the LLC structure, the Delaware registration, the asset transfer strategy, the tax efficiency rationale, the estate planning logic. He used the correct terminology. He cited relevant tax code sections. He was fluent and organized and entirely persuasive to anyone who didn't already know what Hargrove Meridian Holdings LLC actually was. I let him finish. "The transfers from the money market account," I said. $160,000 over 14 months. Where did those go specifically? A fractional pause. "Into the LLC operating account. As I just explained, the LLC's registered agent is a man named Preston Vale," I said. "Preston Vale is also listed as a 50% equity partner in Hargrove Meridian Holdings. I looked him up this afternoon. He's been romantically linked to a woman named Sienna Hartwell for about 3 years." I picked up my wine glass and held it without drinking. "Sienna Hartwell was your paralegal before Denise. She left your firm in January of last year. I remember you saying she'd taken a position elsewhere." The kitchen was very quiet. Elliot's hand was around his wine glass, and he was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not the client smile, not the above-it-all register, not the practiced warmth. Something stripped of all of that. Something that was just a man realizing the conversation he'd prepared for was not the conversation he was in. "Caroline, your father has been writing things down since March of 2021 inches," I said. "Dates, amounts, document numbers, the names of bank representatives who called him about accounts he'd never opened. 41 pages. Both sides." I set the wine glass down. He kept the record because he knew that someday someone was going to need it. He chose me because he decided I was the one who'd know what to do with it. Elliot set his glass down too. Harder than he meant to, it made a sharp sound against the granite. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said. The smooth register was gone entirely. "You have no idea what you're about to pull on or what comes apart when you do. The Hargrove name is attached to relationships in this city that you have benefited from for 6 years. Professional relationships, social relationships, connections that—" "I know exactly what I'm pulling on," I said. "I've known for 2 weeks. I've been methodical about it." He stared at me. "My attorney will be in contact with yours," I said. "I'd suggest you retain someone other than a partner at your own firm." I stood up from the island. "I'm going to sleep in the guest room tonight. We can discuss the logistics of the next steps when you've had time to get proper counsel." "This is a mistake," he said. His voice had dropped low, the lowness of a man who was used to that register, meaning something carrying weight closing rooms. You are making a significant mistake. I picked up my bag from the counter. Raymond told me something once, I said. He said I was the steady one. I looked at my husband, really looked at him perhaps for the first time. With nothing in the way, no performance on either side, just the plain fact of what we were to each other now. He was right. I walked upstairs. Behind me, I heard Elliot exhale a long, controlled breath, the kind a man releases when he's recalculating everything at once. Then I heard him pick up his phone. I heard him dial. He didn't know I'd already had Diane file a motion that afternoon to freeze any further transfers out of the accounts bearing my name. Whatever call he was making, he was already too late. Diane called me at 7:43 the following morning. I was in the guest room, dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed, with my coffee, listening to the sound of Elliot moving around downstairs, the particular rhythm of a man who had not slept and was trying to sound like he had. The coffee maker, the refrigerator, the study door opening and closing twice in 20 minutes. The low murmur of a phone call kept deliberately below the threshold of what could travel through a floor and a ceiling. David Osei came back to me last night, Diane said without preamble. Raymond's personal attorney. What did he have? More than we expected. I heard her set something down on her desk, the precise click of a woman organizing before she speaks. David has been building a parallel file since October of 2022. Raymond came to him when the first Southern Bank situation surfaced, the trust amendment filed without Raymond's knowledge or signature. David engaged a forensic document examiner at the time. The examiner confirmed that Raymond's signature on 4 separate trust documents had been reproduced using a digital overlay technique sophisticated enough to pass a standard bank review, not sophisticated enough to pass forensic examination. I set my coffee cup down on the nightstand. Forgery, I said. Qualified forgery. Technologically assisted. The examiner has written and signed a formal report. David has had it sealed and notarized since January of this year, waiting. A pause. He said Raymond told him to wait until there was someone on the inside who could move at the right time. Someone on the inside. I thought about Raymond on his back porch on Cascade Road, touching the petal of a flower with 2 fingers. You keep this house alive, Caroline. Not a compliment, a designation. How much does David's file cover? I asked. In terms of dollar amounts or in terms of documents? Both. Documents 11 forged or materially altered instruments across 4 financial institutions spanning from March 2021 to February of this year. Dollar amounts, another pause. And in that pause, I heard Diane do what she rarely did, which was take a breath before a number. The forensic accountant David retained has traced a total of $2.3 million moved out of Raymond's personal estate and into Hargrove Meridian Holdings, LLC over 35 months. $2.3 million. The number Elliot had been saying on the phone that Sunday morning, standing at the refrigerator with his back to me. 2.3. Not a projection. Not a target. A tally. A man confirming to someone else that the full amount was in place. The LLC, I said. Preston Vale. Preston Vale is a registered agent for hire. He has no actual equity in Hargrove Meridian Holdings. His name appears on the filing as a placeholder, a common technique to obscure the actual beneficial owner. I heard Diane turn a page. The beneficial owner, per the operating agreement David's forensic accountant obtained through a Delaware records request, is Elliot James Hargrove. Sole member, 100% equity. I stood up from the bed and walked to the window. Outside Habersham Road was doing its ordinary morning business, a woman walking a dog. A delivery truck parked 2 houses down, the particular quality of Atlanta morning light, that made everything look temporarily resolved. I watched a cardinal land on the fence post at the edge of the yard, sit for 3 seconds, and leave. "What about my signatures?" I asked. "The documents I apparently signed, establishing the LLC and the asset transfers." That's where it gets more specific. Diane's voice was careful now, the careful of someone delivering a finding that is both damaging and useful. 3 of the documents bearing your signature were examined by the same forensic document examiner David used. 2 of them show the same digital overlay technique used on Raymond's signatures. One of them. She paused. One of them appears to be a genuine signature. Page 3 of the LLC establishment agreement. Your actual signature. I knew which one. I had known since I first read Raymond's notebook and worked backward through my own memory of the paperwork Elliot had spread across the kitchen counter over those months. There was an evening in September of 2022. A long dinner, 2 glasses of wine, a stack of documents Elliot had described as routine estate updates, his voice carrying the particular ease of a man who has chosen his moment carefully. I had signed several things that evening. I remembered being tired. I remembered thinking I would review the full copies when Denise sent them the way Elliot always said she would, the way she never did. "I signed it," I said. I didn't know what it was, but I signed it. "I know," Diane said. "Which is why we're not leading with fraud on your part. We're leading with fraudulent inducement material misrepresentation and the 2 documents where your signature was forged outright. Your genuine signature on the 3rd document establishes you as a victim of misrepresentation, not a co-conspirator. It actually strengthens the case." I turned away from the window. "There's something else," Diane said. "Tell me." David Osei filed a protective motion with the Fulton County Probate Court in January, quietly sealed on Raymond's behalf, contesting the validity of all trust amendments made after January 2021. That motion has been sitting in a judge's queue for 4 months, held pending additional documentation. She paused. "David believes that with what we have now, the forensic report, the accountant's findings, your photographs of the notebook, and your own testimony, we have sufficient documentation to unseal the motion and move it forward. If the court grants it, the trust amendments are void. Every asset transferred out of Raymond's estate through those amended instruments becomes subject to recovery." "How long?" I asked. "To unseal and move? Days, not weeks. We're not starting from scratch. David built the foundation. We're putting the roof on." Another pause. "Caroline, I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Are you prepared for what happens to Elliot when this moves? Not just professionally, personally. He is still your husband. His father is your father-in-law. Whatever he has done, the consequences are going to be significant and public and permanent." I looked around the guest room. The room where I'd slept for 1 night in a house I'd kept alive for 6 years. Fresh flowers on the entryway table every week. Peonies when they were in season. A life that looked from any reasonable distance like the kind people aspired to. "Raymond chose me," I said, "because he knew I wouldn't stop in the middle." A long pause. "All right," Diane said. "Then here's what happens next." She walked me through it in the ordered, unhurried way she did everything. Diane and David would file jointly to unseal the Fulton County motion that afternoon. Simultaneously, David's forensic accountant would submit a formal complaint to the Georgia State Bar's Office of General Counsel regarding Elliot's conduct. An attorney using his legal expertise and his firm's resources to defraud his own father constituted a disciplinary matter of the highest severity. The 2 financial institutions, where the forged documents had been processed, would receive certified copies of the forensic examiner's report. The account freeze Diane had filed the previous afternoon was already in effect. "One more thing," Diane said. "Preston Vale, the registered agent. What about him?" He's cooperating. A beat. He received a call from someone at Hargrove and Associates 2 days ago asking him to sign an amended operating agreement backdating certain transfers. He declined. Then he called his own attorney. Then his attorney called David Osei. She paused. Preston Vale has agreed to provide a sworn statement. He has emails. I sat back down on the edge of the bed. Emails. In the practiced, methodical architecture of what Elliot had built over 3 years, he had sent emails. To a registered agent, asking him to backdate documents. 2 days ago, which meant after I had confronted him in the kitchen, after he'd heard me say the name Hargrove Meridian Holdings, after he'd understood that something had shifted. He had panicked. Quietly, efficiently, in the way Elliot did everything, but he had panicked. And in panicking, he had handed Diane Osei and David Osei and a forensic document examiner and a forensic accountant and a cooperating registered agent. Something that 3 years of careful architecture had not produced. A direct line. When does it move? I asked. We file this afternoon, Diane said. By end of business tomorrow, the motion is unsealed. The bar complaint is submitted. The bank notifications go out. She paused one final time. I'd suggest you're not home when Elliot finds out. I have somewhere to be, I said. I did. I had a 3 o'clock appointment to visit Raymond in the ICU. I had stopped at a bookshop on Peachtree the evening before and bought him a collection of essays he'd mentioned wanting to read. I had his notebook in my office cabinet safe, and 82 photographs of it in a cloud folder named after a restaurant. And now I had David Osei and a forensic examiner and a forensic accountant. And Preston Vale's emails. And an unsealing motion and a bar complaint moving through Fulton County like a cold front coming down from the Carolinas, slow and total and impossible to stop. I picked up my coffee cup. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway. Downstairs, Elliot's study door opened and closed one more time. His footsteps crossed the foyer. The front door opened. His car started in the driveway, that specific sound, the particular engine note of a man leaving a house he still believed he controlled. I listened to it back out and drive away. Then I picked up my phone and texted Diane 2 words. File it. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Diane filed. It was not the meeting Elliot had asked for. He had asked through his attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, senior partner at a firm in Midtown that handled white-collar defense, retained the same day the bar complaint landed for an informal settlement discussion. A conversation Fitch's letter called it between parties who shared a substantial history and might prefer to resolve matters with discretion rather than through extended litigation. Diane read me the letter over the phone and then waited. No, I said. What we agreed to instead was a formal meeting at the offices of Hargrove and Associates, Elliot's own firm. His own conference room, a choice that was Diane's, and deliberate. She wanted him on ground he thought he controlled. She wanted him to feel the dimensions of the room he'd built and understand by the end of the morning exactly how it had changed around him. I wore a structured wool coat in deep charcoal gray. Flat boots. No jewelry except my watch. My grandmother's watch, small face leather strap, the kind of object that carries weight without announcing it. I had not worn my wedding ring since the night I slept in the guest room. I had not made a point of it. I had simply stopped. We arrived at 9:55. Diane and I, David Osei, and a woman named Patricia Sands, from the forensic accounting firm David had retained mid-50s, reading glasses on a chain, the specific energy of someone who had spent 30 years making numbers tell the truth about people who preferred they didn't. She carried a leather portfolio that I knew contained a 40-page financial analysis tabbed and indexed, with a summary exhibit on the first page that reduced 3 years of deliberate fraud to 4 columns and a total. The total was $2 347,000. The conference room at Hargrove and Associates was on the 14th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, facing north, a long mahogany table that could seat 16. When we were shown in by a paralegal who would not meet my eyes, there were already 5 people on the other side of the table. Gerald Fitch and 2 associates I didn't recognize. A woman from the firm's in-house counsel, and Elliot. He was at the far end of the table, not the head, a choice I suspected engineered by Fitch to avoid the optics of Elliot presiding over a meeting in which he was the subject. He was in a dark suit, white shirt, no tie. The signet ring was on his right hand. He looked like he had slept, which I doubted, and like he had eaten, which I also doubted. He looked more than anything like a man who had spent 3 weeks constructing a position and was now sitting inside it waiting to see if it held. He looked at me when I came through the door. I looked back. Neither of us said anything. We sat. Diane set her portfolio on the table. Patricia Sands set hers beside it. David Osei folded his hands and said good morning to the room with the mild, unhurried politeness of a man who has been in this kind of room many times and has learned that the first person to perform urgency has already lost something. Gerald Fitch opened. He was good, I'll say that. He had the particular competence of a defense attorney who has made a career of making facts seem more negotiable than they are. He spoke about complexity, about context, about the nature of family financial arrangements, and the genuine difficulty of drawing clean lines in matters involving closely held entities and long-standing trust relationships. He spoke about Raymond's health, about the documented cognitive concerns, about the challenge of relying on records produced by a man whose capacity was in question. He spoke about Caroline, about me with a careful, distanced sympathy, the sympathy of a man acknowledging that I had been confused and perhaps misled, without quite conceding by whom. He spoke for 11 minutes. When he finished, Diane opened her portfolio. She did not make a speech. She did not frame or contextualize or perform sympathy in any direction. She took out 4 documents and slid them one at a time to the center of the table. The first was the Forensic Document Examiner's report. 43 pages, the conclusion on page 1-2 signatures attributed to Raymond Allen Hargrove, and 2 signatures attributed to Caroline Hargrove Nee Okafor, were confirmed as digitally reproduced overlays inconsistent with genuine pen-on-paper execution. The second was Patricia Sands's financial analysis. 40 pages. Summary exhibit on the first page. 4 columns. One total $2,347,000. The third was a certified copy of the unsealed Fulton County Probate Court motion, now active, contesting the validity of all trust amendments to the Hargrove family estate made after January 1, 2021, with a hearing date already assigned 4 weeks out. The fourth was a printed email chain. 11 emails between Elliot James Hargrove and Preston Vale, spanning 8 days, the most recent dated 2 days after I had said the name. Hargrove Meridian Holdings in my kitchen. The final email, sent at 11:47 at night, asked Preston Vale to execute an amended operating agreement that would backdate the equity transfer records by 18 months, and in Elliot's own words, create a cleaner paper trail for the restructuring narrative. Diane slid all 4 documents to the center of the table. Then she placed one more thing beside them, a bound copy of Raymond's notebook. Not the original that was in my office cabinet, but a certified reproduction, every page photographed, authenticated by a notary, indexed by date. 82 pages. Both sides. 41 entries, the first dated March 14, 2021. The last dated 11 days before Raymond's cardiac event. Each entry signed at the bottom right corner in Raymond's small, precise hand. RAH, the room was very quiet. Gerald Fitch looked at the documents. His 2 associates looked at the documents. The in-house counsel looked at the documents. and then looked at the window. Elliot looked at the bound copy of his father's notebook, and something happened in his face that I had never seen before, and will not try to reconstruct as anything other than what it was, the face of a man who had just understood the full dimension of what his father had done. Not with anger. With something closer to a complicated grief, the grief of being known completely by the one person whose judgment you could not dismiss. Fitch said something low to his associate on his left. The associate wrote something on a legal pad. Elliot said nothing. Diane spoke into the silence with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. "We are not here to negotiate," she said. "We are here to inform. The Georgia State Bar's Office of General Counsel received our complaint 22 days ago. They have confirmed receipt and opened a formal inquiry. The two financial institutions where the forged instruments were processed have each received certified copies of the forensic report and have opened their own internal reviews. The Fulton County Probate Court hearing is in 4 weeks. Preston Vale has provided a sworn statement and has retained independent counsel." She paused. "We are here this morning as a professional courtesy to ensure that Mr. Hargrove and his counsel have complete awareness of the current state of the record before the next phase of proceedings begins." Fitch said, "We appreciate the courtesy. We'll need time to review." "Of course," Diane said. She was already closing her portfolio. I had not spoken since we sat down. I had not needed to. Everything I needed to say was on that table, in 4 documents and a bound copy of an old man's careful handwriting. But as Diane closed her portfolio and Patricia Sands gathered her papers and David Osei unfolded his hands and prepared to stand, I looked down the length of the table at Elliot. He was looking at the notebook. Not at Fitch, not at me, at the notebook. At the green cover of the certified reproduction, which was the same color as the original, a detail Diane's paralegal had matched deliberately, I suspected, because Diane thought of everything. "Elliot," I said. He looked up. "Your father chose me," I said, "because he believed I would see it through. I want you to know that I understood that. And I want you to know that I didn't do this to damage you." I held his gaze. "I did it because the record deserved to exist. Because he spent 3 years writing it down alone in his breast pocket. Because he loved you, and he still couldn't watch you do this without keeping count." I paused. He kept the count. I'm just the one who brought it into the room. Elliot looked at me for a long moment. His right hand moved to the signet ring. He stopped himself before he turned it. Then he looked back down at the notebook. We left him there. The elevator down was quiet. Patricia Sands checked her phone. David Osei held the door. Diane stood beside me and said nothing until we stepped out into the lobby and the glass doors of Hargrove and Associates closed behind us. And Atlanta opened up in front of us in all its complicated golden, ordinary morning. "You did well in there," Diane said. "Raymond did well," I said. "In there, 3 years ago, alone." She considered that. Then she nodded, once the nod of a woman who understood the difference between the person who builds the foundation and the person who puts the roof on. We walked out into the light. The Georgia State Bar moved faster than anyone expected. Diane said later that it was the emails. In her 20 years of practice, she had seen bar complaints take 6 months to produce a preliminary finding. Sometimes longer. The machinery of professional discipline is thorough, precisely because it is slow, because the consequences of its conclusions are permanent. And the bar takes permanent consequences seriously. But the Preston Vale emails contained something that compressed the timeline in a way that paperwork alone rarely does. They contained Elliot's voice. Not summarized, not interpreted, not filtered through a forensic examiner's technical language. His actual words in his actual syntax at 11:47 at night, asking a man to falsify records, create a cleaner paper trail for the restructuring narrative. That sentence traveled through the Office of General Counsel in Atlanta like a lit fuse. The preliminary finding came 31 days after our meeting at Hargrove and Associates. Diane called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was at my desk reviewing a quarterly audit, the ordinary work of my ordinary life, continuing its ordinary business underneath everything else, the way the cafeteria at Piedmont, Atlanta, had continued its ordinary business 6 feet from where I sat reading Raymond's notebook in a Publix parking lot. The bar has made a preliminary determination, Diane said. They are recommending an emergency interim suspension of Elliott's law license, pending the full disciplinary hearing. I set my pen down. Emergency, I said. It's rare. They reserve it for situations where there is clear documented evidence of harm to clients or the public that makes continued practice an active risk. A pause. The emails qualified. The forged documents qualified. The fact that the victims include his own father, an elderly client of his firm, and his wife, that qualified. An emergency interim suspension meant Elliott could not practice law, could not appear in court, could not sign documents on behalf of clients, could not hold himself out as an attorney in any capacity effective immediately upon service of the order. Hargrove and Associates had 48 hours to notify their clients and reassign active matters. I thought about what that meant for the firm. Raymond had built Hargrove and Associates over 30 years, built it from a 2-person operation on Auburn Avenue into a 14-attorney firm with a client roster that represented some of the oldest and most established black families in Atlanta. He had handed it to Elliott 12 years ago with the specific and documented belief that Elliott would carry it forward, grow it, honor what it represented. What it represented in the Atlanta legal community was reliability, the kind of firm you trusted with the things that mattered most: your estate, your legacy, the financial architecture of what you were building for the people who came after you. The kind of firm whose name, when you said it in certain rooms, meant something beyond the services it provided. That name was Hargrove, Elliott's name. The interim suspension order was served on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, 2 things had happened that Diane had predicted and one that she hadn't. The first 3 of Hargrove and Associates' 7 largest client accounts submitted formal requests to transfer their files to outside counsel. Not quietly, through certified letters copied to the bar, the language in each letter careful and deliberate, the language of clients who had their own attorneys advising them on how to exit a relationship whose trustworthiness had been publicly called into question. The second, Elliott's 2 equity partners at the firm, men who had joined Hargrove and Associates a decade ago and had built their own client bases under its umbrella called an emergency partners meeting, and voted 4 hours after the suspension order was served to restructure the firm's management agreement in a way that effectively removed Elliott from any operational role pending the outcome of the disciplinary hearing. They did not dissolve the firm. They did not abandon the name. They were protecting the institution from the man currently threatening it, which was, I thought, exactly what Raymond would have done. The thing Diane hadn't predicted was the call from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. A reporter named Marcus Webb had been covering the Georgia State Bar's disciplinary proceedings for 3 years. He had a source Diane suspected someone in the bar's administrative office, though she couldn't confirm it. And he had the broad strokes of the interim suspension and its underlying basis. He called Diane's office on Thursday afternoon asking for a comment. Diane called me before she responded. "You don't have to engage," she said. "The public record will speak for itself. The bar's findings are public once the preliminary determination is issued. Webb can report what's in the record without us adding to it." "What does the record say?" I asked. "Enough." A pause. "It says an Atlanta attorney was suspended on an emergency basis following documented evidence of forged instruments, fraudulent asset transfers totaling over $2 million, and obstruction of evidence. It names Hargrove and Associates. It does not name you or Raymond by relationship. You're referred to as a family member and a spouse. But anyone who knows the firm will draw the connections. I thought about that. About Raymond on his back porch touching the petal of a flower. About the Sunday afternoons he'd come by while Elliot was playing golf. About the steady one, said over and over across years like a man confirming a calculation he'd already made. Tell Webb that the family has no comment at this time, I said. But tell him that we're aware of his reporting and that we appreciate accuracy. Diane was quiet for a moment. That's a very specific thing to say. Yes, I said. It is. Marcus Webb's piece ran the following Monday. It was thorough, factually precise, and notable for what it didn't contain: no speculation, no unnamed sources beyond the bar record itself, no dramatic language. Just the documented sequence of events, laid out in the ordered, unavoidable grammar of public record. Emergency interim suspension. Forged instruments. $2.3 million. Fulton County Probate Court hearing pending. I read it at my kitchen counter at 6 in the morning with my first cup of coffee. By 9 o'clock, my phone had received 14 text messages from people in our social circle, some expressing concern, some asking if I was all right. 2 that were simply question marks from women who had been at our dinner table often enough to understand that a question mark was the most honest response to what they'd read. I answered the ones that deserved answers. I let the others sit. At 10:15, Elliot's mother called. Margaret Hargrove was 73, a retired schoolteacher, a woman of deep faith and precise diction, and the specific dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime holding things together that other people let fall apart. She had been kind to me in the measured, formal way of a woman who respects someone she isn't certain she understands. We were not close. We were cordial consistently, which in certain families is its own form of closeness. She called from Raymond's house on Cascade Road, where she had been staying since his surgery, and when I picked up, she was quiet for a moment before she spoke. I read the paper this morning, she said. Yes, I said. Another pause. Raymond told me before the surgery, he told me he'd given you something to keep safe. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone controlling it with effort. He didn't tell me what. He said I didn't need to know what. He said I needed to trust that you would handle it. I pressed my hand flat against the kitchen counter. The granite was cool under my palm. He was right to trust that, I said. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I heard in the background the wind chimes on Raymond's back porch, his late wife's wind chimes, the ones that had been hanging there for 20 years, turning slowly in the Atlanta morning. I know, she said finally. Her voice had changed. Not broken, Margaret Hargrove did not break, but opened slightly the way a door opens when the pressure on both sides finally equalizes. I know he was. She hung up before I could respond. I stood at the kitchen counter for a while after that. The peonies on the entryway table behind me were fresh. I had put them there 2 days ago, the first time I'd bought flowers for that table since the night I slept in the guest room. Not for anyone. Not for the appearance of a life. Just because they were in season, and because some habits are worth keeping for your own reasons. Downstairs, the ordinary morning. Outside Atlanta, doing what Atlanta does, continuing complicated, golden, indifferent to any individual story playing out inside it. Elliot's phone had been going straight to voicemail for 4 days. His equity partners had changed the access codes to the firm's document management system the previous Friday. His assistant had quietly updated the firm's website to remove his photograph from the partners page, replacing it with a placeholder that said, "Profile coming soon," in the mild, apologetic language of a website that knows something the public doesn't yet. That morning, Gerald Fitch submitted a motion to the bar requesting a 60-day extension before the full disciplinary hearing. The bar denied it in 6 hours. The hearing was in 3 weeks. And in Fulton County Probate Court, A judge had reviewed the unsealed motion and the supporting documentation, and had issued a preliminary order freezing all assets identified in the contested trust amendments pending the outcome of the hearing. Every dollar that had moved out of Raymond's estate through a forged or fraudulently induced instrument was now frozen in place, unable to be moved, spent, transferred, or restructured. $2.3 million sitting perfectly still waiting to go home. Raymond came home on a Tuesday in June. Not to Habersham Road. That house was no longer mine, in any way that mattered, and hadn't been for weeks. He came home to Cascade Road, to his own porch and his late wife's wind chimes in the backyard where the old pecan tree had been dropping the same quiet shade for 40 years. Margaret had repainted the front door while he was in the hospital. A deep, particular blue, the color of something decided rather than chosen. I noticed it when I pulled into the driveway and sat with it for a moment before I got out of the car. He was thinner. The surgery had taken something from him that would come back slowly if it came back entirely, and he knew it. And had made his peace with it in the way Raymond made his peace with most things, by looking at it directly and declining to perform a reaction. He was sitting in the chair on the back porch when I came through the house, a glass of water on the table beside him, a book open in his lap that he wasn't reading. The wind chimes were doing their slow, idle turning in the June air. He looked up when I came through the back door. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he smiled. Not the careful, measured expression he usually offered. The one that gave away exactly what he intended it to give away, and nothing more. This was something different, quieter. The smile of a man who had placed a bet on a person a long time ago and was sitting now in the specific unperformed satisfaction of having been right. "Steady," he said. I sat down in the chair beside him. We stayed there for 2 hours. We didn't talk about the notebook or the bar complaint or Elliot or the Fulton County hearing that was now 11 days away. We talked about the pecan tree and whether it needed to be trimmed, and a documentary Raymond had watched in the hospital about migratory birds, and a memory he had of taking Elliot fishing at Lake Lanier when Elliot was 7 years old, and declaring with the absolute conviction of a 7-year-old that he would never eat a fish he had personally met. Raymond told the story with the fond, rueful precision of a man who had told it many times, who had loved the boy in it completely, who understood that loving someone completely does not protect either of you from what they become. At one point, Margaret brought out a plate of sliced fruit and set it between us without comment and went back inside. Through the kitchen window, I could see her moving around unhurried, the specific efficiency of a woman who has spent decades keeping a household running, and does it now, from pure muscle memory. When I stood to leave, Raymond reached into the pocket of his cardigan and held something out. The original notebook, not the reproduction, the original, the blue cover worn soft at the corners, the leather darkened along the spine where his hand had rested against it for years in his breast pocket. "It did what it needed to do," he said. "It belongs with you now." I took it, held it in both hands the way he had held it when he pressed it into mine in the hallway at Piedmont, Atlanta. It was lighter than I remembered, or maybe I was steadier. "Thank you," I said. "No," he said, and looked back at his book. The conversation was over in the way Raymond's conversations ended, not abruptly but completely. The door closed gently from the inside. I drove downtown. The Fulton County Probate Court hearing lasted 4 hours over 2 days. I was present for both. I sat beside Diane and David Osei at the plaintiff's table and watched the judge, a woman named Honorable Constance Reeves, 60 years old, the particular focus of someone who has spent decades distinguishing between what people say and what the documents prove, work through the record with methodical attention. Patricia Sands testified for 90 minutes. The forensic document examiner testified for 45. David Osei submitted Raymond's notebook into evidence, the original which I had returned to him the morning of the first hearing day. sealed in a protective sleeve, and it was marked as Exhibit A, and placed on the evidence table where it sat with the unassuming authority of something that has been quietly correct for a long time. Elliot was present with Gerald Fitch. He did not testify. Fitch had advised against it, which was the right call and the only call available to a defense attorney whose client had sent 11 emails to a cooperating witness. Elliot sat at the defense table in a dark suit and looked at the table in front of him for most of both days, with the focused, contained expression of a man directing all available energy toward not reacting visibly to anything. On the afternoon of the second day, Judge Reeves delivered her ruling from the bench. She spoke for 22 minutes. I have the transcript. I have read it several times, not for the outcome which I had understood was likely before the first day ended, but for the specific language she used. The careful, measured sentences of a judge who understood that the record in front of her was not just a financial dispute, but a document of something larger, a son's betrayal of a father's trust conducted through the instruments of the very profession the father had built his life around. The trust amendments were void. All of them. Every instrument dated after January 1st, 2021, bearing Raymond Allen Hargrove's signature, was declared null and without legal effect on the basis of forgery, fraudulent inducement, and material misrepresentation. The assets transferred out of Raymond's estate through those instruments, the full $2.3 million plus statutory interest, calculated from the date of each individual transfer, were ordered returned to the Hargrove Family Trust within 30 days, plus interest. The interest alone was $194,000. I did not react visibly when Judge Reeves said the numbers. I had learned that from Raymond, the discipline of receiving information without performing a response to it. I wrote the figures in the margin of my legal pad in my own small, precise handwriting and drew a single line underneath them. Diane put her hand briefly on top of mine on the table. Then she removed it and went back to her notes. What happened next happened quickly, the way consequences do when they've been building for a long time and finally find the opening they've been waiting for. The two financial institutions that had opened internal reviews following the forensic report submitted their findings to the appropriate regulatory bodies within a week of the probate ruling. One of them, First Southern Bank, the institution Raymond had called about the fraudulent trust amendment back in 2021, filed a civil complaint against Elliot individually, and Hargrove and Associates as an entity seeking recovery of processing fees and damages related to the fraudulent instruments they had unwittingly executed. The Georgia State Bar's full disciplinary hearing concluded the following week. I was not present for that one. I didn't need to be. The Bar's proceedings are conducted on the record already established, and the record was complete. Diane called me when it ended. Disbarred, she said. One word. The door closed completely. Elliot would not practice law in Georgia. The Bar's national database would carry the disbarment indefinitely, the record that follows an attorney through every subsequent attempt to sit for any state bar in the country, the professional equivalent of Raymond's notebook, small and precise and impossible to misplace. The firm survived. The two equity partners, men named Broderick Cole and James Whitmore, both of whom had built their practices inside the Hargrove name, and had to their credit made the right call within 4 hours of the suspension order, restructured Hargrove and Associates as Cole Whitmore and Associates. They kept 3 of the 7 clients who had initially sent transfer requests. They sent Raymond a letter signed by both of them expressing their commitment to the values on which the firm had been founded. Raymond framed the letter, put it on the wall of his study next to a photograph of the original Auburn Avenue office. 2 men in it behind a single desk that I recognized as the same desk now in the corner of the study, older and darker with use, but the same desk. He showed it to me the afternoon he hung it. They're good men, he said. Elliot had good examples. He said it without bitterness. without the editorializing of a father who needed his grief to have an explanation. Just a fact delivered in Raymond's manner, direct, complete, and then done. The divorce was filed by mutual agreement, which in practice meant that Elliot did not contest it. Gerald Fitch, operating now with a client who had no law license and a civil complaint pending and a disbarment on his record, was not in a position to advise contest. The settlement was straightforward in the way that things become straightforward when one party has no viable leverage and the other has Diane say. I received my full share of the marital estate, a figure that reflected 6 years of a shared financial life, honestly accounted for. I received my name back legally, officially, the paperwork processed and filed, and returned to me in an envelope I opened at my kitchen counter on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee that had not gone cold. Caroline Okafor. My mother's name. My grandmother's name before her. Kept. The afternoon the divorce was finalized, I drove to Raymond's house on Cascade Road and sat on the back porch with him and Margaret, and we ate dinner together. Margaret had made groundnut stew, the recipe she'd learned from Raymond's mother decades ago. The kind of dish that carries an entire history inside it and asks nothing of you except that you pay attention to it. We ate and talked about small things, and the wind chimes turned in the evening air, and the pecan tree held its old shade over the yard the way it always had, indifferent to everything except the slow, patient business of growing. At the end of the evening, Raymond walked me to my car. At the end of the driveway, he stopped and looked at me with that quiet, complete regard of his. The look of a man who has been watching something carefully for a long time and has reached a conclusion about it that satisfies him. "Your mother raised you right," he said. I thought about her ledger, the column she called "What We're Building," the pocket sewn into the lining of her winter coat, the precise, patient discipline of a woman who understood that the most important things you build are the ones nobody sees until they're needed. "She did," I said. Raymond nodded, went back inside. I sat in my car in the driveway for a moment before I started the engine the way I'd sat in his driveway months ago, in the dark with his notebook in my bag. And a life I hadn't yet begun to dismantle saw sitting quiet and enormous around me. The blue front door was lit by the porch light. Margaret's choice. Deep and decided, and exactly right. I started the car and drove home. I sold the house on Habersham Road in September. Not because I needed to, the settlement had been more than fair, and Diane had structured it in a way that left me with options rather than obligations. I sold it because I wanted to. Because every room in it had been designed to impress people who were passing through, and I was done passing through my own life. Because the kitchen had been in a magazine, and the staircase was double, and the entryway table had held fresh flowers every week for 6 years, and none of it had ever quite felt like mine. I found a place in Reynoldstown. Smaller, older, a craftsman bungalow on a street with actual trees, not the landscaped, deliberate trees of Buckhead, but the old kind, the kind that predate the neighborhood and will outlast its roots, going somewhere deep and unhurried underneath everything. The kitchen had original tile from some time in the 1940s, white with a thin blue border slightly uneven in the way of things made by hand. The back porch needed work. The previous owner had left a wind chime hanging near the door, a simple wooden one, and I left it there. I moved in on a Saturday in late September with the help of 2 colleagues from my firm. It had a rented truck and a box of my mother's things I'd kept in storage for 4 years since she passed her ledger books, her winter coat. A small framed photograph of her and my grandmother standing outside a church somewhere in the 1970s. Both of them squinting slightly into the sun. Both of them with the particular expression of women who know something and are choosing for the moment not to say it. I hung the photograph in the kitchen above the original tile where I would see it every morning. The notebook I framed myself. Raymond had given it to me, and I had returned it for the hearing. And after the hearing, Diane had signed it out of evidence, and brought it back to me in the protective sleeve the court had put it in. I took it to a framing shop on Edgewood Avenue, a small place run by a man named Gerald, who had been framing things in that neighborhood for 30 years, and who looked at the notebook with the brief, practiced assessment of someone who understands that what people bring him to frame is never really about the object. "Shadow box," he said. "Yes," I said. "Deep enough to see the cover clearly. Simple frame. Nothing that competes with it." It came back 10 days later in a frame of dark walnut. The notebook centered the worn blue cover facing out the leather, soft and darkened along the spine, where Raymond's hand had rested against it for years. I hung it in the hallway near the front door at eye level, the first thing you see when you come in, and the last thing you see when you leave. Beneath it, on a small card mounted inside the frame, I had Gerald print 4 words in a clean, simple font. He kept the record. That was all. No name, no explanation. Anyone who needed to understand it would, and anyone who didn't would simply see an old notebook in a walnut frame and move on, which was fine. The notebook wasn't for them. Raymond visited in October, the first time he'd been out to Reynoldstown. In years, he had history in this neighborhood, he said, from before it was called Reynoldstown by anyone who didn't already live here. He came on a Sunday afternoon with Margaret, who brought food in containers that she stacked in my refrigerator with the efficient authority of a woman who has never brought inadequate quantities of anything anywhere. Raymond walked through the house slowly, the way he did everything now, not from infirmity exactly, but from a new relationship with time, a willingness to let a moment be the full length of itself. In the hallway, he stopped in front of the framed notebook. He stood there for a long time, long enough that Margaret came around the corner and saw what he was looking at, and stood beside him, and neither of them said anything. Margaret took his hand. He let her. Then he looked at me over his shoulder with that quiet, complete regard. "Good," he said. One word. The door closed gently from the inside the way Raymond's doors always did. We had dinner on the back porch. The wooden wind chime turned in the October air. The old trees held their shade over the yard, going amber and gold at the edges, now the particular beauty of things at the end of their season that know they'll come back. Margaret told a story about Raymond when he was young, something embarrassing involving a borrowed car and a wrong turn somewhere in Alabama, and Raymond listened to it with the expression of a man who has heard a story so many times it has become a form of affection rather than a narrative. I laughed genuinely for the first time in a long time in my own kitchen in my own house, in a neighborhood with old trees and original tile and a wind chime I had inherited from someone I would never know. My mother used to say that keeping a record is an act of faith. Not faith in any particular outcome. She was too practical for that kind of faith, too acquainted with the ways outcomes disappoint. Faith in the idea that the truth has weight, that if you write it down carefully enough in your own hand with the date at the top and your initials at the bottom, it will eventually land somewhere with enough force to matter. Raymond believed that. He believed it for 3 years alone in his breast pocket in a house where his son came by on Sundays and sat in the same rooms and looked at the same walls, and Raymond wrote it all down anyway because the record deserved to exist whether or not anyone ever read it. I think about that when I think about what it costs to keep going when no one is watching, when the evidence is still accumulating and the moment hasn't come, and you are simply a person sitting on a back porch writing things down, trusting that the right person will eventually be in the right hallway at the right moment to receive what you've been carrying. I was that person. I didn't choose it. Raymond chose it for me the way certain things are chosen for us, by people who have been watching longer than we knew. What I chose was what to do once I understood what I was holding. And what I chose was to be the kind of woman my mother raised, precise, patient, unafraid of the full length of a difficult thing. There will be people in your life who keep records of you. Good records, bad records, the complicated kind that are both at once. There will be people watching with more care than you know, noting the gap between what you say and what you do writing it down in their own small hand with the date at the top and their initials at the bottom. Be the person whose record you can stand behind. And if someone hands you a notebook in a hospital hallway and tells you not to let them bury it, understand what they're really saying. They're saying, I've been waiting for someone steady enough to carry this. They're saying, I believe that you are that person. They're saying in the only language that outlasts everything else, the language of a careful record kept in good faith. I trust you. Honor that trust. See it through. That's the whole thing, really. That's all of it. He kept the record. I kept my name.